So picture this diagram with the people as users of VMs on a cloud server. All these VMs are running on a machine or server which has a single operating system. The security of this operating system is vital to hold this entire infrastructure together. Do you agree? So with this in mind, enter Overshadow, which presents an application with clear text view pages, and this operating system with encrypted view. So this essentially cloaks the application data to the operating system. And this is important because privacy and integrity of applications are highly sought after, especially in big cloud servers like AWS. So Overshadow focuses on these two goals as their primary objectives to protect. The privacy of applications during attacks is vital because on a cloud server, for example, the application data is exposed without privacy. So the operating system has free reign of the memory and the data coming in and out of these applications, and this must be protected. And integrity is also very important because any tampering of the application data must be detected, especially if an outside application were to exist on this network, or if the operating system itself attempts to use this data that maybe it shouldn't be using. This must be noted. So basically, the perspective of these Overshadow team is to not trust the OS. They want to introduce a last line defense. So even if an attack compromises the operating system, the application data remains confidential and encrypted. The idea is to protect the application data during an attack, but not to protect the availability of the applications or the data. So if the data is compromised and tried to be tampered with, the application will stop and the system will shut down based on this Overshadow architecture. So why use Overshadow? There are three methods that are used to approach these problems of privacy and integrity. One, by rewriting the OS to higher and lower assurance places. Two, by refactoring applications into trusted and untrusted areas. And three, to make new hardware, new processor features that require modifications to the hardware of the operating system. These all are overtly quite time consuming. And this is why the Overshadow back in 2008 was such a great idea and revelation in this area. And it was kind of the first all-encompassing structure to protect applications from an untrusted operating system. So there are some problems to address with this architecture. One being the data leakage. How does this system protect data leakage when decrypting sensitive information? How can control transfers be permitted securely when transferring between the operating system and the application? And this idea again that viewing the OS as an unreliable and insecure realm. So on data leakage, sensitive information such as cryptographic keys stored in memory can be read, especially with privileges of the operating system, which makes it essential that a system with ambitions such as Overshadow have countermeasures to enable some sort of medium where sensitive data can be stored and prevent it from being leaked during transfer. So because OS has so much power in running these VMs and viewing data, I was really interested to see how they made this all work. I view the strategy as three different complexities. One, where the OS is excluded from any information other than the directions to complete its task. So for example, in a operating system fault and a page fault. The second strategy, where the operating system needs some of the VM's data, which is completely encrypted, because the idea is that operating system is not able to see this application data. So this is involved with simple system calls like reads, writes, file IO. And the third strategy, where the OS needs to create queues or processes that need to communicate bytes in real time. So example, like system calls such as pipe, clone, fork, or signal handling. Things get a lot more complex in that third strategy. So how do these strategies work? They approach this using a concept called multi-shadowing, along with what they call cloaking. So with this diagram here, the entire system uses this premise of cloaking based on multi-shadow. Overshadow can perform these secure control transfers to and from the OS, as well as decrypt the data without leakage by introducing this concept called shim. The shim will interpose on events like system calls and signal delivery, modifying their semantics to enable safe resource share between a cloaked VM and an untrusted OS. It's important to understand that if the OS or hostile code tries to modify this encrypted data, the VM or application will be terminated. So the idea is the operating system will act as a mediator and not understand what it's doing, but just be moving data in a common memory interface. So now let's dive into the lower level techniques that enable cloaking. So the physical address space here, it's important to understand that how a VM communicates with the underlying OS that we're trying to isolate. So this physical space in the middle is an illusion presented to the guest OS running on the application. And the hypervisor, or the VMM, performs physical memory mappings to the mappings on the host OS, on the physical system running all the applications, while the guest OS on the application handles the mappings from virtual to the physical addresses handled in the hypervisor. So with this in mind, we can introduce multi-shadow to the mix, which provides multiple views of physical memory, where an application has its view and the system has its view. So there'll be multiple application views, and it's up to the system view to communicate with them. So suppose, for example, the application performs access to its home page. So that will be seen in plain text. And suppose the OS or unrelated application tries to access this page. It will observe it as unmapped and will not be able to recognize it. So because of that, it'll fault into the virtual machine monitor or hypervisor, which will gain control and encrypt the context of this plain text page in the application, will then hash it and remap the page from the application view into the system view. And then say the application tries to access this page now that it's in its encrypted state in the system page. It will not be able to access it and will fault to the hypervisor because it's been encrypted, but because it once had access, it will be able to verify correctly with its hash, decrypt it, and it'll be able to, the hypervisor will remap it into the application. So thus, the idea is to make everything look like a memory mapped object. So everything is going through a common memory interface. And this is done by emulating file I/O and other functionality to transfer these resources, stacks, and heaps properly. And this enforces the idea that the OS is just moving memory to and from within the memory interface without actually having to see what the data is. It's all encrypted. So cloaking is really just this concept of multi-shadow plus encryption. So let's dive into the Overshadow architecture and how it implements these three strategies I mentioned earlier and security precautions that come with each. So first, this is where the OS is excluded from any information other than the directions to complete its task. So, for example, in OS. To understand this, the architecture must be equipped with a shim, as seen in this diagram here. And Overshadow leverages this shim to help identify application contexts without relying on an untrusted operating system. So the shim is linked to the application address space at load time, and it contains cloaked and uncloaked memory that is able to communicate with the hypervisor or VMM. The shim works when the application is executing, as seen in circle 1. Then a fault traps into the hypervisor when the kernel tries to access something in the application page. The hypervisor VMM then scrubs the registers, zeroing them out so the kernel can't see the original application state. And then the hypervisor also sets up a trampoline to the shim. So when the operating system returns, it can then jump to the shim. Then, once this is all set up, the control is transferred to the kernel or operating system. So we're in box 3 there. And The kernel handles a fault, returns to the shim, and the shim then hypercalls into the VMM again, and execution is resumed in the application. So this covers a secure control transfer. What about secure application identification? So to identify an application, this is where replay attacks can come into play. I'll refer you to the paper for details. However, conceptually, this is just handled by using an initialization vector as input to encryption. So pages with identical plain text context will encrypt to different ciphertexts. And these secure integrity hashes are taken on a per page basis. So every page transfer is encrypted differently. So how do these transactions occur when minimal OS functionality is needed? This is how that occurs in this diagram. So moving on to strategy 2. This is where examples like system calls, which would represent explicit interactions with the operating system, where, as you can see, only a few layers are added to the strategies as just seen before, which just includes the marshalling and unmarshalling data going into and out of the kernel, respectively. So in this stage, this is where the OS needs some of that VM data, which must be encrypted, so it cannot view it. So with, for example, simple system calls like reads and writes and file IO. In this, the shim interposes on system calls because these system call arguments may be pointers to cloaked or encrypted memory. And this could be a problem because if an outside application or operating system is able to fetch these pointers, that application will have free reign over these memory regions and can use these openings to redirect the system call interface, allowing the application to read or modify memory that should definitely be protected. So it is essential that these arguments being passed into the kernel can be marshaled, which converts data structures into a specialized format that cannot be used. And the shim does that marshaling. So before sending sensitive system call arguments, these arguments are marshaled and the results get sent to the OS. Then when the kernel can state these results are unmarshaled, they're passed to the shim and then to the VMM, which then are unmarshaled and sent back to the application. So this is how the transactions work when more OS functionality is needed and there are sensitive system call arguments involved. So moving on to the final strategy, this is when system call adaptation is required. So for these examples, I would highly suggest reading into the paper for these details because each system call represents a new kind of structure and new ways of doing things. So pipe, clone fork, and signal handling, these are all very special cases that they cover in a very interesting manner. So we're going to move now into how the Overshadow architecture can be integrated into your operating system. So from these strategies described, Overshadow can reveal quite an innovative way to approach application isolation. And it can be noted that the integration of Overshadow requires no changes to existing operating systems, nor any additional hardware support. Instead, it just works by extending isolation capabilities of the virtualization layer to allow protection inside each VM or application being used. So it could also be realized in other virtualization platforms, since it doesn't suspend on the specific features of the VMware hypervisor that was done in the experiment in the paper. So overtly, an all-encompassing setup is bound to have flaws. So a malicious kernel can still observe an application's memory patterns and measure the time that application code sections take to complete. And this is where side channel attacks come into play. So Overshadow does not protect against these side channel attacks. And these attacks use repeated observation and statistics to overcome the noise in the system that leads to exploitation of secret-dependent memory and allows victims to access this. They do state in the paper that OpenSSL should fairly protect against these side channel attacks. However, it can be quite questionable, this claim, based on the advanced side channel attacks that are seen today. They also did make clear that cloaking increases system call performance, so it does slow it down by a factor of 3 to 5. And this is primarily due to an extra pair of address-based switches between uncloaked and cloaked disk contexts. And some other overlooked things that they did not mention is that since multi-shadow memory cloaking does not depend on specific features of the VMware hypervisor, it can also be realized in other virtualization platforms. They did claim this, however, they then go on to say that changes would be required to enable hardware assist for other architectures like x86, Intel VT, etc. And also, they did not integrate Overshadow with maximum security in mind in their example they used for their experiment in the paper. The environment they used may not have reflected the security, and they mentioned that in the configuration, the hypervisor was not fully protected from the Linux host OS. And secure deployment of Overshadow will require running the hypervisor directly on the hardware, such as using a VMware ESX server, which they did not do. So moving on to some related work, I found another paper called Deterministic Side Channels for Untrusted Operating Systems. And this directly references Overshadow and the vulnerabilities that Overshadow has that they're able to exploit. So it was really interesting to see how Overshadow worked and then see how it was broken. So I would highly recommend following up with this paper because they state Iago attacks, which they describe more in the paper, demonstrate isolating memory and CPU state is not sufficient to protect legacy applications on a running operating system. So the operating system can exploit a lack of verification in return values and return carefully crafted values, such as memory mappings that overlap with the stack to corrupt application behavior. And this is the side channel attacks that they talk about, Iago side channel attacks. So some final thoughts is that this team at VMware has developed Overshadow as a means of enhancing security in commodity operating systems. Approaches like redesigning applications and using high assurance and low assurance parts in an operating system are just not a viable option. They believe cloaking is more useful as a more general operating system abstraction. And in particular, cloaking eliminates the need to trust the pieces of the system that are merely responsible for just moving data from one place to another versus those that are actively using the data. And this is going back to that point that the operating system should just be viewed as untrusted. And if all it needs to do is move data, that's all it should be trusted to do. So to finalize with some questions,